It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to the Phil Ferguson Show. A little later on for our interview, we're going to talk to Cameron Riley, and he is going to talk to us about his movie and a little bit about his own personal experiences in life, but his relatively brand new movie about Jesus and the marketing of Jesus way many years ago, 1800 years ago, and how this religion, this story, this myth that really wasn't particularly more popular or even as popular as some of the other things going around at the time became the most popular and dominant religion throughout at least Europe and parts of the Middle East for a while. So I think it's fascinating. Absolutely love those stories. So we're going to talk to him. And of course, I do recommend the movie. I had rented it and watched it, at least rented it online. You used to go to the stores and get tapes. You remember that? Yeah. I made the mistake of buying a very high quality, high-end Betamax machine back in the day. That was great for a while. But hey, you know what? Things change. We move forward. It's not like I doubled down and bought laser discs when that was the cutting-edge technology. So now, then of course, it goes to DVDs, and now we just stream everything. I got a couple of little odds and ends here that have to do with investing that I'm going to include in the opening segment here. The first one is that apparently we are now officially in a recession. What is this? The National Bureau of Economic Research is the organization, the part of the government that apparently is in charge of calling a recession. And historically, and I think I talked about this less than 6 months ago, it is defined as 2 consecutive negative quarters of gross domestic product. And of course, right after I said that several months ago, I happened to read that somewhere in the past few years, and I don't think this has anything to do with Trump, it was changed to several consecutive months of negative GDP. So one of the problems you have is that you can't really declare a recession until you've been in it for a while, but apparently it has changed from 2 consecutive negative quarters, which would be 6 months, to several consecutive negative months. And they have looked at this, and March was so bad because of coronavirus and people wanting to stay home or being required to stay home, that the negative effects of March outweighed the positive of January and February. And I think that would be clear if you looked at your portfolios, or at least the stock market's expectation of future economic activity. And they've looked at this and they figured that April and May were so bad, and June, while we're getting some recovery, the quarter's probably going to be negative. And so they just threw their hands up and said, okay, it's a recession. So just in case you have the conversation with any of your friends, you heard it here first, maybe, that the United States of America is officially in a recession. Some of the nice stuff is it looks like jobs are coming back, although there might be some trickery or fuckery or something with the numbers. We'll see how that pans out. But at least we're not losing millions and millions of jobs every week like we had a few weeks before. So, hopefully we can have jobs and safety. Another quick update, particularly relevant to a lot of my clients and maybe a lot of people that listen to the show. TD Ameritrade and Schwab are joining. Charles Schwab, big broker dealer. And the nice thing that I like about this, because I use TD Ameritrade as the qualified custodian for the bulk of my money and almost all of my clients' investments, TD Ameritrade has never shied away from the fact that they are being bought. And they're not trying to play a game about this being some kind of merger of equals. They're not equals. Charles Schwab is bigger. Charles Schwab has way more money. And Charles Schwab flat out is buying TD Ameritrade because TD Ameritrade was losing money and was having a little bit of trouble. So what it all means, I've talked about it before. I don't think there's going to be a lot of change in the short run, particularly for people who buy and hold index funds. Probably the biggest change might be a little slicker and prettier website. Although I'm surprised TD Ameritrade keeps making material upgrades to their website. So I guess that's not going to change a whole lot. But they've just reached another milestone, this merger or acquisition. The Department of Labor has closed its review, and apparently they have removed some other waiting period called the Hart-Scott-Rodino antitrust waiting period. And that is outside of my understanding. I don't really know what that means, but apparently they're very excited about it because it's another thing that you have to clear to get forward. The owners, the shareholders of both TD Ameritrade and Charles Schwab on the 4th of June officially approved Schwab buying TD Ameritrade. And in this update document that I got from TD Ameritrade, which is very nice that they're keeping advisors up to date, and hopefully they're telling clients, account holders, the same thing. So maybe you already saw this, but just in case you didn't, they are still on schedule sometime in the second half of 2020 to close the deal, to complete the merger. From a stock and legal perspective, what actually happens to what you see in your accounts and how documents look, that could take a while. And as I said before, I do think that they're going to focus more on people who do a lot of trading activity. There's a lot of money to be made from traders, charging small fees or being able to capture a little bit of the spread between the bid and the ask price. So I think that'll be priority, and just how you see and look at or manage or buy your index funds, or how I buy them for you, your clients, probably won't change much in 2020. And I don't know that it needs to change a lot for 2021, but we'll see. We'll keep an eye on that. The other thing that is in the news is that the Department of Labor, and yes, I do blame Trump and the Republican administration for this, they have now taken some steps to make it more likely that your 401k in the future can your money can be invested into private equity funds. And what that means is, technically it's not forbidden at this time. I was a surprise to me. I thought it was, but your employer generally wants to be relatively conservative with the 401k. They also, rightfully so, are very hesitant or flat out will not give you advice, which as an employee, if I remember way back in the day when I was an employee of a company, if you go to HR and ask them what you should put your money into, most companies do the proper thing and tell you that they can't answer that question, which is a really safe answer to give, because if they tell you to buy stocks and it goes down, they're in trouble. If they tell you to buy bonds and the stocks go up, they're in trouble. It's a no-win scenario. So most mutual funds are now, not mutual funds, most 401ks are mutual funds. Some are managed, some are index funds. Most companies now have a nice basket of high-cost funds with a few index funds. They have some stocks, some bonds, some international. And usually most people, unless it's a very small company, can get a couple of really good funds. And we're at a place where I'm pretty happy with that. One of the problems is that this entire part of the financial industry, the private equity funds, aren't really allowed to play. Now, not from a legal standpoint, but employers don't want to allow them in, and employers have been sued in the past. Well, that's now been cleared up. Employers are no longer responsible. So one of the things I've talked about recently is that you might see going forward in your 401ks the possibility of buying an annuity, which I think should be illegal, flat out illegal. If it's not illegal, it's a really fucking stupid idea. If annuities had any argument whatsoever in my mind of providing any kind of benefit. Possibly it's the avoidance of tax. Well, 401k is already an account that enjoys the avoidance of tax. So you might see that. But now the new thing that is getting the approvals from government agencies is private equity funds. And what this means is that they do not have to follow the rules that are required for mutual funds or index funds, which are a subset of mutual funds. They're a different instrument. They're a different entity. And they don't have to recalculate their price every day. You may not be able to buy and sell every day. They may be able to buy and sell things that a conventional mutual fund cannot. As an example, they could invest into an oil drilling expedition. They could invest in companies that are privately held but need some money. So they can get an ownership stake or lend money to an upstart company at a really high interest rate, hoping to score big. And unfortunately, these often have very high fee structures. 2% would not be unheard of. So the disclosures are dramatically less. You may not know what you own. And it's really hard to judge because, again, as I did a little bit of research prepping for this commentary, there are private equity funds that have beaten the stock market over the last 9 or 10 years. There's a few, but most of them underperform the market. So the one that's given to you as an option in your 401k, which is it? Is it one of the 5 or 10% that apparently have beaten the market, even though they have different rules for how they account for shit? So I'm not even sure that's the case. Or is it one of the 90% that underperform the market? And then, of course, you have higher fees. So if your mutual fund options are not publicly available and have a symbol, I'm really not interested in them. And the other thing that has been growing, and I have talked about this before, is also another thing called proprietary funds. And these are mutual funds that follow most of the rules about mutual funds. They're just not publicly traded. And Fidelity could create one. T. Rowe Price could create one. And these are things that are offered only to companies or agencies or trusts or universities with billions of dollars in money. And they might be fantastic, but they might not. And the disclosure stuff is a little more tricksy. And so it's one of those things that people in the financial services industry often want to make more money with your money. And if a part of that industry feels left out, they are going to pressure politicians to be let in. And the 401k part of the market is huge. A lot of people have more money in 401ks than they do in IRAs, Roth IRAs, and taxable accounts. And up till now, the private equity funds have been closed out of that. So something to look forward to in the coming months or the next year as your 401k does its annual update and or change, just so the HR person can validate their existence to a new program. You might start seeing private funds or private placement funds, private equity funds, and annuities available in your 401k. And my guidance at this point, until proven different, avoid the temptation of something that looks better until you can actually confirm that it is better. And if you want me to look at something specific that you've been presented with, of course you can contact me. My email is phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com. You can do that. And the first email you send, you may include your phone number, but please do not attach any account documents, your address, your social security number. We want to have a little bit of caution, and I will call you and or send some times where we could meet. And if we decide after that that a document or two might be necessary or helpful, we can go down that road. So we're going to have our brief interruption, our regularly scheduled Investing Skeptically segment, and then we're going to talk about the marketing of Jesus H. Christ. This Investing Skeptically segment is on a super shitty fund, I guess. It's called USO. It is an ETF on oil. Now, it happened to get caught up extra brutally in the COVID coronavirus problem because the demand for oil has fallen incredibly sharply, but also in the fact that Saudi Arabia and Russia were playing a game of chicken at the same time, where they did not want to cut their oil production. They wanted others to cut their oil production, and no one could agree. And so a lot of oil was being pulled out of the ground at very high rates. More oil was being produced, created, pulled out of the ground than was being used. And that, of course, pushes down prices. And while we had this glut of oil pending, or actually already here, suddenly we have the coronavirus, COVID-19, where demand falls at the same time. So you have a large supply and a big drop in demand, and you create a situation where the value of something falls because there's lots of it and nobody wants it. Matter of fact, the futures, even for a brief time, went negative, which means if you took delivery, you'd have to pay. You'd have to pay money, or you get paid money to take the oil. And of course, a fund like this, and we talked about this with gold. One of the problems is that a fund trading in oil does not want to take delivery of the oil. This might be a good fund, and even then might, if you were in the oil business and you wanted to hedge against price fluctuations, maybe. Of course, you probably would actually just go out and buy your own oil futures for your own purposes if you're in the oil business and you want to moderate price risk. The problem is that futures are notoriously expensive. So, for example, if you invest in the stock market, you on average, over long periods of time, will make 10% minus transaction costs, minus trading costs, minus taxes, which is why the expense ratios of funds are so important, why having money in IRAs or Roth IRAs or 401ks is so important, because you want to reduce the things that take you away from that theoretical 10% annual return. Well, with real assets, things like gold, oil, the long-term returns are close to 2 to 3%. And if you take into account inflation, they basically match inflation and don't make more than inflation like stocks do. And so your net result is either 0 or +3, +2, depending on how you look at inflation, minus all of the costs in doing the transactions. So futures generally are net 0 minus costs. So it's a losing game. You have to know what you're doing. You have to be very good at it. And you have to have a reason for doing it, I think. It's not just something you just buy. Well, this fund, of course, like I said, it's had a terrible couple of months. If you invested $10,000 in this fund 10 years ago, and again, let me say that you invested $10,000 10 years ago, you would now have $621. You would have lost 94% of your money. Again, the fund is down sharply over the last few months. So if we look at just the beginning of 2020, before the big drop in oil, you would have easily lost 50% or more of your investment. The expense ratio is only 0.79 only. I mean, it's cheaper than a lot of funds, I'll grant you that. But one of the problems with the expense ratio is it only includes certain costs. There's rules, maybe even a law, what has to be included in the expense ratio. The cost of buying and selling shares, stocks, bonds, or future contracts is not included in the expense ratio. It cannot be known in advance. So if there is a 1 or 2 or 3% annual expense in doing all the trades, you will lose that money. It's just going to happen, but it won't show up as part of the expense ratio, which makes this type of fund a very difficult thing to own. And it's a very poor choice, unfortunately, for a long-term investment. I mean, if you really had some reason to believe that oil was going to spike and jump up and you wanted to ride that horse, maybe you buy a fund like this. But as a long-term investment, it is a no-win scenario. You're not going to make money. It's just not going to happen. And so this is one of those things like with gold, where the long-term average return is about 3%, almost equal to inflation. I would expect that to be generally true of oil unless we get to some kind of crisis where we can't find enough anymore. So it's a bet on those kinds of things. But this fund has not provided benefit. Matter of fact, like I said, if you put in $10,000, you would now have $621 10 years later, losing 94% of your money. And odds are, even if oil jumps back up in prices, well, this fund might do well in the short term. There's no way of knowing that, and it might continue to do, as I would expect, very poorly in the long run. I happened to look up on Investopedia this fund, and it had this nice little box, I guess. It says, important. In April 2020, crude oil prices collapsed amid COVID-19 pandemic to a 20-year low. In late April, the price of USO dropped more than 30% to just above $2 per share, and new trades were halted as the fund's managers began making structural changes in efforts to avoid a complete collapse. USO management then announced a 1-for-8 reverse share split to go into effect after the market closed on April 28th, 2020. A reverse split reduces the number of shares outstanding into fewer and proportionally higher priced shares. Such an action typically signals a stock or exchange traded product in distress. Yeah, no shit. So anyway, that's just something about that. So if you want to get creative, that's cool, but you need to know what it is that you're getting creative with. And funds that buy what they call real assets or minerals or gold or oil or anything like that, they generally aren't buying the product. They're not buying oil and storing it somewhere. They're not buying gold and storing it somewhere because the costs of storage of assets of those types can be prohibitively expensive. And so what they'll normally do is they'll play the futures markets. And if futures swing wildly, so will your portfolio. And again, futures on average are a zero-sum game minus the expenses involved. So just some thoughts on real assets and particularly this oil fund.
Nothing seems crazy when you're used to it. There's so much crazy shit everywhere. We're used to it. And everything seems crazy when you're not used to it. That's why so many comics make fun of Scientology, right? Because because it's a batshit crazy religion, but it's no more batshit crazy than every single religion. It's just new, Christianity is super old, but it's fucking crazy. I mean, you're born a sinner. By being born, you are a sinner and you're going to hell. But you can just apologize and then you can go to heaven. No big deal. If you're a murderer, same thing. It's just apologize and go to heaven. You can be Hitler and go to confession and say, "Forgive me, Father, I killed 6 million Jews." And the priest would just be like, "No problem, say 10 Hail Marys." And Hitler goes to heaven. Hitler goes to heaven is the name of my band. Scientology is weird because it's new. It feels weird in our ear holes to hear people worshiping a guy named Ron. We know Rons in our life. He had to change his name to L. Ron because there was another Ron Hubbard in the Writers Guild. That's how recent a religion it is. And people who follow their religion to the letter of the law are just silly. I mean, I want to tell Hasidic Jews, I promise you, God will not mind if you wear a nice cotton blend in the summer. You're being fucking ridiculous. But we live in the greatest country in the world. A country where we have freedom of religion and separation of church and state, only we don't at all, and nobody says anything because we're used to it. It says in God we trust on our money. It says in God we trust above the judge's bench in a courtroom, in a court of law, where you have to put your hand on a Bible, the Christian Bible. It's not my Bible. I mean, if I tell the truth, it's because I tell the truth, not because I put my hand on a book and made a wish. It's fucking crazy. That's craziness.
The Phil Ferguson Show is for educational purposes only. Nothing said on the show should be interpreted as personalized investment advice. Your investments should be based on your situation, and you should consult with your financial advisor before taking any action. The show may contain ads. These ads are placed into the show by the hosting company after I finish recording and editing. I have little control over the content of the ads, and you should not assume that I support their products or claims. If you choose to support the show via the new Patreon page, that support does not create an advisor-client relationship.
You're listening to The Phil Ferguson Show.
All right, everybody. As promised, our interview for today is Cameron Riley. How are you, sir?
Great, thanks, Phil. How are you, mate?
I'm good, and people may notice you have a very, very subtle accent, and that's from where?
I am currently sitting in Brisbane, Australia. You probably just think of it as paradise, but officially it's the Federal Republic of Australiaville.
Oh, very, very nice. I think that I've seen that on a globe once, Australia. It's about that big, right?
About that big.
Yeah. It's like a Texas joke. 'Cause I've seen it on the map. I can cross that in about 4 hours driving across Australia?
Something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Of course, it's beautiful and lush greenery all throughout the middle.
Of course.
Yes.
Yeah. Nothing can go wrong with the plan to drive from one coast to the other. No one's ever died thinking that would be easy to do.
Yeah. Just put in some petrol and push the pedal down.
Don't take any water, no food.
No.
Don't worry about that. You'll be fine.
Yeah, I think what could go wrong was the perfect answer you had there. So you have a film, which we're going to talk about very briefly, about some guy named Jesus. What was the title of that? Marketing Jesus, marketing guy.
Marketing guy. Marketing the Messiah.
Marketing the Messiah, which I have seen in preparation for this interview, but sadly, a few weeks ago, but I think I remember the gist of it. But before we get into that, so that's going to tease the listeners. They're going to want to make sure they stay tuned to hear about this movie. Let's talk about you. And if I recall correctly, you started at a very young age in a Catholic family and going to Catholic church. Walk us through that experience, if you would.
Oh, you want me to go back that far?
Well, yeah.
You want me to summarize the last 50 years?
Yeah. Just the gist of it. All the good stuff they taught you.
I grew up in Australia in the 70s. I was born in 1970, and one thing that Americans quite often may not realize, I think, about Australia is it is a very secular country, and it has been since at least the 1970s. We are not a very religious country in as much as religion doesn't really tend to take central stage here. There are plenty of religious people. I think still majority Christian country, but only barely. And when I grew up, my parents were lapsed Catholics. My dad was a Scot, my mum was an Aussie, but my grandmother was, on my mother's side, was a churchgoer, and so as a young fella, I went to Catholic church, I did my Holy Communion, I did my first confession, I did a little bit of Sunday school in preparation for that. But around the age of 8, I went to church, rode my bike to church one Sunday morning by myself, and heard the priest talk about original sin, and he said something to the effect of all babies are born into sin. And I happened to have a little baby sister at home at the time, and it just struck me that any philosophy that said babies were somehow evil was horrible, and I didn't want to be part of it. So I left and rode home and said to my parents, I'm not going back to church anymore. And they said, yeah, that's fine, whatever. And so I became an atheist at the age of 8. But I remained fascinated with Christianity and have studied it my entire life.
That's very nice. I got out when I was 13, so you beat me by 5 years. But yeah, it's a great point because everyone knows babies are tasty, so I don't see what the problem is. But there's a lot of philosophies there that are, in my opinion, repugnant. The phrase that I use is that Christians don't have morality because of the Bible; they have morality in spite of the Bible.
Yes.
And so you got this film, and where did this nugget of an idea start? I always like origin stories. How did it come about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've been producing podcasts for the last 15 years, and I've done a lot of history, deep, long-form history series. And one of those has been on the Julio-Claudians. We started, my co-host who's from Virginia and I started with Julius Caesar about 6 years ago, I think, and we just killed off Caligula last week, and we're about to get into Claudius in a month or so. But about 4 or 4.5 years ago, one of my listeners, who happened to be a German fellow documentary producer living in Melbourne, Australia, called me up and said, I've got an idea to do a film. I'd like you to work with me on a film based on something you've been talking about on your Julius Caesar podcast. And I said, oh, yeah, what's that? And he said, well, this whole idea that Jesus was based on Julius Caesar, because I had been having some fun with the similarities between the two. And I said to him, well, listen, honestly, I don't think there's enough in that theory to make a good documentary. I think it's a fun topic to talk about, but it's probably not very credible or serious from a scholarly perspective, although I know some people take it seriously, but it's not a theory that I think has a lot going for it. But I said to him, what I would love to do is a documentary about the origins of Christianity, because for decades I've been reading the works of New Testament scholars, and it's a fascinating topic. But every time I try and talk about it with my Christian friends and family, they think I'm just talking complete nonsense. They think, oh, that's just atheist propaganda.
Right.
When I try and talk about it to my atheist friends, they're completely disinterested because they're like, ooh, religion, that's yucky. I'm not interested. And I often have to point out, well, are you interested in Julius Caesar? Oh, absolutely. Are you interested in the history of Alexander the Great? Well, yes, of course. I said, well, you realize they both had religions built up around them as well after they died. So why are they interesting to you? And this isn't. Would you agree that Christianity has had a significant impact on the development of Western civilization? And they will agree that it has. And I'm like, well, stop being an idiot. Learn about it. It's fascinating. It's one of the most incredible stories, and it forms the central part of the story of Western civilization for the last 2,000 years. So I decided that would be a really great topic to bring more awareness to, because most people aren't going to go and read the New Testament scholars. They're not going to go and read ancient history about this period. Christians don't really want to know, and atheists don't really care. So I wanted to make a popular, entertaining, factual, scholarly film that would be accessible to both of those audiences. And the third audience there being obviously religious people that aren't necessarily Christians. So to everybody, basically. Christians, atheists, and others.
And so kind of a spoiler alert, was there an actual Jesus, or is this kind of an amalgamation of people and things that may have happened in the past?
Well, look, we touch on that briefly towards the end of my film. I think the only intellectually honest position I can take on that subject is we don't know. There are arguments for and there are arguments against a historical Jesus. Personally, I don't find either of them completely convincing. I can see merits to both arguments. But look, the honest truth is we have so little evidence for an historical Jesus that it's very difficult to be certain that he existed. The best that we can say, I think, is he might have. Is it likely? If somebody put a gun to my head and said, take a position on it, I would say, I think it is less likely that he existed as an historical person. I tend to slightly favor the alternative argument, but even that, but it is also, there's a lot of gaps, there's a lot of hurdles you have to jump over to figure out how else it may have emerged. There's a bunch of competing theories. None of them are particularly convincing, in my opinion. But we really don't know, I think, Phil.
Yeah. Well, the short answer and pithy answer I give to people is that the odds of Jesus actually existing is probably slightly more than Hercules.
Yeah.
But who knows, right? We weren't there. Now, in the movie, we're talking about how Jesus, really wasn't that popular. I mean, the followers weren't that great, and he appeared to apparently some people following an out of the way and run down religion, and wasn't doing so well. But somehow it became a big thing, and that's of course the marketing. So, how did the marketing start, and what was the marketing?
Well, how it started, we don't really know. We know that the most successful salesman for it was Paul of Tarsus, or Saul of Tarsus, St. Paul, as he's most commonly known. But I think the thing I wanted to communicate to people is to understand how Christianity emerged, we really need to understand Judaism in the first century. Need to understand that for 1,000 years, the Jewish prophets have been telling the Jews that they were Yahweh's chosen people, and he was going to make sure that they ruled the earth and that everyone in the world was going to worship Yahweh, and he was going to usher in peace across the world, and they were going to be the people sitting on top of the pile.
Right.
But century after century after century, with a small period of success, but for most of that millennia, that 1,000 years up into the first century, things had not been going well for the Jews. And of course, around about the time that Jesus is supposed to have been born, during the reign of Augustus Caesar, Judea finally became officially part of the Roman Empire after the death of Herod the Great. And so it was just getting worse and worse and worse. Now, it must be very hard to be a Jew and in that period, and on one hand, believe that you're God's chosen people, and on the other hand, just having the shit kicked out of you constantly. And of course, then in the mid to late 60s CE, it got even worse when the Romans came in and destroyed the temple. Now, to put that in context, I often say, imagine if the Muslims were able to get into Rome today and completely destroy the Vatican, how challenging that would be for Catholics. And they worship the same God, the Muslims and the Catholics, so it's still Yahweh kicking the shit out of Yahweh there, which is the sexiest form of violence, I think, Yahweh on Yahweh violence.
Yeah.
But this was the pagan gods, the supposedly inferior Roman gods, destroying Yahweh's house. And the reason the temple was even a bigger deal than the Vatican is the Jews obviously believe that Yahweh, like the Mormons do with their temple, believe that God actually lived in the inner sanctum, the holiest of holies, inside of the temple. So literally the pagan gods came in and kicked Yahweh's ass. Now, this must have been incredibly depressing. And, of course, million Jews, according to Josephus, died. Probably might have been less than that. We don't really know. But a ton of them died. A ton of them got kicked out of Jerusalem, even more so sort of 60 years later during the next big Jewish-Roman war. But it was a very difficult time for Jews, and so they must have been trying to figure out, well, what does this mean? We can't sacrifice at the temple anymore. Our God just got his ass kicked. Just so happens, of course, that according to most New Testament scholars today, the very first New Testament gospel, the gospel according to Mark, was written around about the time, probably just after the destruction of the temple. So we have a new form of Judaism emerges based mostly around Gentiles, not Jews, and it evolves after the destruction of the Jewish temple. So Christianity came out of Greco-Roman society, and it seems to be a form of syncretism, a syncretized religion. It seems to have little bits of Judaism, little bits of Platonism, little bits of different Egyptian or pagan agricultural religions. As Robert Price likes to say, you look at the Eucharist, eat this bread, it is my body, drink this wine, it is my blood. Well, that's would seem to be quite obviously lifted from an agricultural several agricultural gods, right? The god of the grain.
Dionysus.
Dionysus is of the grape, I think. And Osiris, I think, was one of the gods associated with the grain harvest. Which would make total sense. If you eat grain, you're eating the body of the grain god. If you drink the grape juice, you're drinking the blood of the grape god. And yet we find that in one of Paul's epistles, even before the Gospels. So it seems, and we know that there was a lot of mystery religions around at the time, and they tended to be experimenting by pulling bits of this and bits of that and jamming them together and coming up with their own sort of cult. But the big difference between the rest of the mystery religions that were around in Rome in the first century and Christianity is the first rule of a mystery religion, like Fight Club, was you don't talk about the mystery religion.
That's
hence
right.
The name mystery.
You've got the secret answer. It's kind of like Scientology, right? You can't know until you do a nice personality test. You can't learn about Lord Xenu or the fact that the devil was Jesus' brother. So, these things are mysteries, and you got to get into it. But something changed, and that thing is Paul and Saul. Is that where we're going?
Well, Paul was out there selling his version of it, which, as we point out in the film, and I'm sure most people know, his version of the Jesus sect seemed to be markedly different from what other people were selling. And he talks about this himself in his epistles. He talks about how he had when he went to Jerusalem the first time and met with Peter and James, who were part of an earlier Christian sect, maybe the original Christian sect, Jesus sect. They disagreed with him on some pretty fundamental ideas, the major one being Paul obviously didn't think it was necessary for Gentiles to convert to Judaism in order to be part of the Jesus Club. They didn't have to get circumcised. They didn't have to eat kosher food, obey the laws of Leviticus, sacrifice at the temple, etc. Peter and James seem to be convinced that they did have to do that this was a Jews-only club. And so they had major differing views on this. Paul also talks about the argument that he had. He got up in Peter's face at Antioch and basically called him a fraud to his face in front of other Jesus followers. Paul also talks about other evangelists going around and trying to convert Paul's communities to some other form of Jesus worship when he wasn't there. He mentions people that we don't know anything about. He mentions some sort of evangelist called Apollos, who was preaching what Paul calls a different Jesus What does that mean? Who was Apollos? We have no idea. Does he literally mean a different Jesus? Because, again, as I like to point out to people, Jesus is just the anglicized version of the Greek version of the Hebrew version of Yeshua, which means God saves, Yahweh saves, or Savior. So Jesus just means Savior. Christ is the Greek version of Messiah, Messiah for the Hebrews, which was supposed to be the warrior king Messiah that they hoped was going to save them for their enemies. Jesus Christ just means Messiah the Messiah, or Savior the Savior, which is a pretty handy piece of branding, or it would have been if he'd actually saved the Jews from the Romans, which of course he didn't. But so Paul's doing something and maybe having some limited success in his lifetime, although not a huge amount from what we can tell. But the key thing is, of course, the Jews got destroyed between the first Jewish-Roman War and the second Jewish-Roman War, between 66 and 135 CE. A lot of Jews got killed. A lot of Jews got pushed out of Jerusalem. The temple gets destroyed. Now, of course, these early Jesus cult members, Peter and James and those guys, from what we can tell, were Jews. They were Jews who just thought that Jesus was the Messiah. And if all the Jews got killed and banished, then they would, and their followers would probably have got swept up in all of that. So who was left to represent the Jesus sect? The Gentiles, Paul's community, who would have been considered heretics or blasphemers probably by not only the Jews but the original Jesus community, who were, of course, also Jews. They're the last people standing. And again, what makes them different is a number of things. Number one, they start coming out with books. Well, after Paul's dead, probably. He probably died in the 60s under Nero. Mark's gospel comes out around 70, so Paul's dead, but somebody inside of Paul's community wrote the gospel according to Mark. And the gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John, and Acts of the Apostles as well. They're all Pauline in nature, although they differ little bits between themselves. Matthew is a little bit more Judaizing than Mark is, but he's still Pauline. So these are the guys that are left, and they've got a mystery religion that actually has stuff written down, which was an anathema to a mystery religion, but they broke the rules and they got away with it. And then the other things that I think are really important is when you look at what they were promising people. First of all, they were mostly reaching out to the poor and downtrodden. There was a lot of poor, a lot of poor and downtrodden.
Yeah, kind of like today, unfortunately.
And they were telling them, like a modern-day doomsday cult, the world's going to end any day now. Paul believed that. The authors of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John all believe that. The world is going to end literally any day now. Not 1,000 years, not 2,000 years, not one day in the future, but any day now, the world is going to end. And thirdly, if you worship this Jesus guy as a god, you will get eternity in paradise, what we call heaven. Now, this is the interesting things that I think a lot of people don't realize about this is adding Jesus as a god when you're a pagan who already acknowledges and worships a pantheon of Greco-Roman gods was probably no big deal.
Right.
Romans believed in new gods all the time. Every time a merchant came back from Egypt or Babylon, they came back with new stories of new gods, and people would sign up to them. Mithra, obviously the cult of Mithra, was a Persian god originally, was very big, particularly in the Roman military at the time, way bigger than Christianity was for probably a century or two or three even. We don't really know because it was a mystery religion and they didn't write anything down. They
Fools.
did it right. They did mystery religion right.
The fools. If only they'd written it down.
So adding another god in that first generation and probably many generations after that probably weren't strict monotheists. They probably just added Jesus as just another god that, hedge your bets, right?
Yeah.
It's like, taking I don't know how horse racing works. I was going to make a horse racing analogy, but I'd probably embarrass myself.
Why?
Doing the spread. I think it's called a spread.
I was going to say like the Game of Thrones. I swear on the old gods and the new.
Good analogy. Exactly.
Why not?
Why not? What is there to lose? And then the other thing that people don't tend to understand is that heaven wasn't something that Jews really talked about much back then, or now even. It wasn't a concept really in the Old Testament. And it wasn't really something that the Greco-Roman religions talked about much either. You know, there was this idea of Elysium that you might get to go to if you were a great warrior who dies in battle, or a great king or something like that, an emperor. But really, they didn't have, as far as we can tell, they didn't have any familiars. Plato talks about different levels and something and perfection, but he doesn't really know either. There was no one really going around offering eternity in paradise. And as I say in the film, hell, I'd be happy for a weekend in paradise. If you're selling tickets to paradise and all I have to do is add this dead Jew as one of the many, many gods that we already worship, including, by the way, Julius Caesar was a god. Augustus Caesar was a god. Augustus Caesar was already called the Savior, who had been sent by the gods to Earth to forgive the sins of the people. He had all of these titles.
That sounds familiar.
Decades, generations before the Jesus sect was around, as far as we know. So these concepts were very familiar to Romans and Greeks at the time. And so they're getting the poor people whose lives suck are being told the world's going to end any day now. Add this guy as just one of the gods, and when the world ends, you'll get eternity in paradise. It's a pretty easy sale, but even then, it took centuries and centuries for them to really get anywhere in building up any sort of mass support. And of course, that really changes when Constantine becomes emperor, gets rid of the competing emperors after the years of the four emperors, consolidates his power at the Battle of Milvian Bridge against Maxentius. Supposedly, Jesus comes down from the heavens and supports him in killing tens of thousands of his Roman enemies.
Yeah, you segued right into where I was going to go next. How did this get to be the official religion? And this is where we are in the story.
Yeah, so I mean, it doesn't become the official religion with Constantine, and why Constantine supported Christianity, we don't really know. My best guess is that they were becoming a bit of a pain in the ass of the previous emperors. Diocletian had massive problems with them because they refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods, which was putting all of Rome at risk. It's basically the equivalent of, in today's age, refusing to socially isolate or wear a mask when you go out in public. By being the Christians were the libertarians of their time. They refused to participate in what most Romans believed was for the social good of Rome. If you didn't sacrifice to Mars or Jupiter at the appropriate times with the rest of the population, you might be inviting a plague upon the people as punishment.
And that could be seen as quite a dick move then.
It was an incredibly dick move. And in fact, if you go back and you read the writings of the first church father, Eusebius, who was a contemporary of Constantine, he writes about the stories of the people that were so supposedly persecuted under Diocletian's era in the late 200s. And Eusebius reports the fact that governors and centurions around the empire would, when they were arresting Christians under the order of Diocletian because they were refusing to sacrifice, these guys would beg them to do it. Look, just eat a piece of the burnt meat. That's all. We don't care if you spit it out. We don't care what you believe in when you go home. That doesn't matter. Just do this, or else you could rain down plague upon us, or we could lose a battle, or our enemies could invade us. The Goths are just waiting for an opportunity to come in there. We know this. Goths were also Christians, by the way, which people don't tend to realize, but that's another story. So it's just do it. Do it for the sake of the social good. And the Christians were like, no, screw you. We're not doing that. So anyway, Constantine made a decision. Listen, better to bring them in on the inside, I think, rather than fight them. Was he a true believer? I don't know. Maybe he was, but there's no evidence that he abandoned the rest of the pantheon. Certainly, if you look at the Arch of Constantine next to the Colosseum, you're not going to find any mention of Jesus or Yahweh up there, but you'll see reference to Sol. So it starts with Constantine, though. He legalizes Christianity. But he leaves all the rest of the philosophies out there, the rest of the religions and the schools of Plato and the Epicureans, etc. But that all changes in the late 300s when Theodosius I is emperor. And because he refuses to punish certain groups, mostly Jews and some others, as much as Bishop Ambrose of Milan wants him to. The Roman Empire was based in Milan, was the capital of the empire at the time. Ambrose excommunicates Theodosius. Not allowed to go to church, not allowed to get confession. Now, Theodosius, coming almost a century after Constantine, was a true Christian, and according to our sources from the time, he was tormented by the fact that he'd been excommunicated, because if he died, which was quite possible through means fair or foul for an emperor, and he hadn't received his last confession, he would not be able to go to heaven.
Oh my.
And so after a year or two of excommunication, he finally broke down, begged Ambrose to remove his excommunication, and Ambrose said, I will, on one with one criteria, and that is that you make Christianity the state religion and you ban, on pain of death, all other forms of worship, philosophy, religion, except the Jews. They left the Jews around. They weren't allowed to build new temple. They weren't allowed to build new synagogues. They weren't allowed to convert people. They weren't allowed to evangelize, but they could exist. Everything else, the Epicureans, the Stoics, schools of Plato and Aristotle, all of the ancient pagan religions that have been around for 1,000+ years were banned on pain of death, and the Roman Empire became a Christian theocracy.
And I'm thinking the lesson to learn here is that if you want to have a successful religion, it's not about the truth. It's about control of the narrative, control of the conversation. Oh, dare I say, marketing, making everything else illegal and punishing them while raising up this one specific religion again, not because it's true, but because it's your choice. That's an interesting thing to think about for me.
Well, they did. I mean, I think for the first few hundred years, they marketed it very successfully with some of those ideas I mentioned before. And also the other idea, which I think people don't really appreciate, is the crucifixion. I mean, the idea of human sacrifice had been a very powerful concept throughout primitive human cultures. As far as we can tell, all around the world, human sacrifice was a big deal. And, particularly when you sacrificed someone to appease an angry god, you picked the child, son or daughter of a king or a priest, somebody who, or a great commander. You needed to sacrifice something of great value, and it was an honor to be sacrificed in most cases for the good of the tribe. But human sacrifice had been, it existed in early Judaism. There's evidence of it in the Old Testament. I mean, the most famous example is when Abraham takes his son Isaac up into the hill and he's going to slit his throat. And then an angel appears, because Yahweh tells him to.
Yeah.
And he's willing to do it. And then an angel appears at the last minute and go, whoa. He was only kidding. Don't worry about it. He hadn't had his coffee that morning. He was grumpy. You should know better than to ever listen to anything Yahweh tells you when he hasn't had his coffee in the morning. Chill, just go kill a sheep instead. It's all good. we know that the Romans sacrificed humans going back early enough, and so did the Greeks. But of course, by the first century, the Jews and the Romans and the Greeks had all outlawed human sacrifice. What Paul manages to do, if it in fact was Paul who came up with the idea of the crucifixion, certainly the earliest mention we have of it is in Paul's epistles, is he's bringing back this idea of a human sacrifice, because obviously that's what Jesus appears to be. He's a human sacrifice to appease the angry God, to forgive humanity of its sins. And this is somebody being sacrificed or sacrificing themselves, self-sacrifice to save others is an incredibly powerful idea. I remember as a young kid, probably around about the same time I left Catholicism, I saw the original version of the Poseidon Adventure. Are you old enough to have seen that film?
Yes, I'm familiar with it.
Gene Hackman in the film, complete arsehole to everybody, just a really mean piece of shit through the whole film. And then right at the very end, there's a half a dozen people left. He's one of them. They can see the rescue crew, but they can't get up the walkway because there's hot steam or gas or something is blasting across the walkway. He dives off to turn off the vent and then smiles and lets go and falls into the flames. And as an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old, whatever it was, however old I was, it came out in 1980, so I would have been 10. That was an incredibly powerful scene. I remember it to this day. It really shook me to the core. And of course, still in Hollywood today, whether it's an Avengers film where Iron Man sacrifices himself to save the world, or it's Titanic.
Captain America jumped on a hand grenade, so
there you go.
That narrative continues.
Or the Batman film where he flew out into the ocean with a nuclear bomb in the bat plane. Self-sacrifice is still an incredibly powerful motif. It goes, predates obviously Jesus since the dawn of time, really, as far as we can tell. So Christianity managed to tap into that. He died for our sins. He died so that we may live. That's an incredibly powerful idea. It was 2,000 years ago. It still is for 2.2 billion people around the world today who resonate with that.
Yeah. What I'd like to do is, if you've got any last comments about the film, your work, podcast, blogs, whatever, and let us know how people can reach you. I'm hoping someday we have conferences again, and maybe someone's listening that knows somebody that can have you fly over to the States and present your movie. What do you think of that?
Yeah, well, we had a whole bunch of screenings sold out for March.
Nice.
Of course,
yeah.
Then all the cinemas shut down just before we did it. But yeah, that'd be lovely. Well, you can reach me at CameronRiley.com. I've got a book that came out earlier this year called The Psychopath Epidemic, about how most of our problems around the world are caused by psychopaths in positions of power in business, politics, religion, the military, the police. Check that out.
Very topical.
I do a bunch of podcasts on ancient history. I do a podcast on investing with a friend of mine who's a very successful investor here in Australia. We talk mostly about value investing models and methodologies for stocks. I do lots of different stuff to keep me off the streets. Great.
Well, we'll leave the rest out there as a tease to figure out what happens to Jesus and the rest of the story. But again, that's Marketing the Messiah. It's actually available for streaming right now. Where should someone go to watch it?
MarketingTheMessiah.com.
And then it's just a couple of bucks, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, well, depending on where you live, but yeah, I think it's about $5 in America if you want to stream it. Sure.
Yeah. You have your family around, get the kids and nieces and nephews who are in a religious family, and have them sit down and watch this. I think it'd be $5 well spent.
Well, quite seriously, it's designed to be Christian friendly. It's very fair. It's a dozen biblical scholars in it. Half of them are Christian biblical scholars. I tried to make it as balanced and as fair as possible, so Christians really have nothing to complain about.
I like it. Well, Cameron, thank you once again for being on the Phil Ferguson Show. I greatly appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, Phil. Good fun.
I'm not even an atheist. I'm what you might call an anti-theist. I think religion is a bad idea. I think it's a tool used by the powers that be to control the weak-minded in our society. But you can't pull that on a form, so I just write Church of England. I'm actually a lapsed Catholic. Any Catholics in? Oh, quite a few over there, yeah. I'm a lapsed Catholic. I knew my days were over in the Catholic Church when I found myself at communion thinking, I like the wine, I'm loving the wafer. Any chance of a bit of cheese? Don't get me wrong, though, I still respect the Pope. I like to think of the Pope as king of the pedos. He's the best one. He's the ringleader. He's Gary Glitter's boss. Catholics are a weird bunch. Look at the rosary. Basically, anal beads. I saw a documentary recently on Channel 4. It was all about faith. And in it, someone went, well, of course, Scientology is a made-up religion. I thought, as opposed to... It's one of my favourite things is to get Christians talking about Scientology. Because the Christian will go, Scientologists, they're nutters, they believe in aliens. And then you can say to the Christian, what do you believe in again? It's a benevolent zombie that's coming back to save you, isn't it? Good luck with that, that will probably happen.
You're listening to The Phil Ferguson Show.
I thank you very much for listening. I appreciate all the people that listen to the show and all the smart people that from time to time send me corrections or things I've made mistakes on. I do appreciate that. And nothing actually right now to correct, but there'll be more. I just wanted to throw that out there that I do appreciate that. I've only done this 24 years, so there's still things to learn and still mistakes to be made. The interesting thing is that way back in the beginning of the show, I had a segment on a fund called USO Oil. It was an ETF fund, and it has filed for restructuring with the government. And even now, as oil prices have gone up, it has not done well. So I know somebody I have to make a phone call to that owns this, and we're going to get out of it, I think. But if that happens to be you, I'm talking to you. No one else will know. But some fun things there that you try something different and it can hurt. And that's kind of ties back into way at the very, very beginning. Newfangled fancy things Phil doesn't like. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm missing the opportunity of a lifetime. But I look at the stock market and I see, 200 years of data, which, yes, more than 120 years ago, it gets really sketchy. But you can do that. You can make money. If you hold on for many years, almost everybody makes money. You could even say it's kind of like gambling, except for when you gamble, playing cards or slot machines. Slot machines will often say something like, the loosest slots. They pay out 92 or 95 or 97% of all the money that's put in them, which means that on average, every time you push the buttons, pull the arm and the old style ones, every time you do that, you're losing money. That's how it works. That's how they build those buildings. That's why they build those buildings. Every time you're losing money, and hopefully you do it responsibly and you have a little bit of fun and entertainment out of it. I don't find gambling entertaining at all. I work too hard to make money. I don't want to give it up for some blinking lights in my face. If I want to do that, I'll rent a movie, I guess. And I'm out a couple of dollars, not hundreds and hundreds of dollars. Anyway, I didn't want to get on that soapbox. Other funny things that I didn't mention it early on is it's allergy season. So if I fail to edit out clearing my throat, or I sound a little more gruff than normal, my apologies. I have found, though, that with considerable filtration, like I have a great big filter in my office, which is actually also good for electronic equipment to pick up the dust. I have a really big filter in our bedroom, and then a additional filter in our basement, and it actually helps keep down the mold spores so you don't get mold. Of course, there's a dehumidifier down there for the summer, which it's going to become more and more active. Anyway, just a side story, but it actually the filters can be kind of expensive, but I figured out that it's less than getting shots for allergies. I think the most allergic thing that I know of from some historical testing is tree pollen from a certain type of tree. It's the birch tree. And in our previous house in Champaign, we had one that grew right outside of our bedroom window until I killed it. But birch tree pollen is probably the worst, but other tree pollens are also bad. And depending on the season and the weather, some years are worse than others. So hopefully I can struggle through and get the shows done. I think I just heard or saw on Facebook, I have to double check, but I'm pretty confident in the sources that I saw, that the Center for Inquiry's conference, CSICon, in the fall has been canceled. And they're not postponing it or delaying it. It just canceled. And this is one of the problems with things. Even if they're several months away, there's a lot of work. There's a lot of work to prep and bills to pay. And you don't really want to wait to the last minute to cancel it if you can avoid that. So I've heard that. I don't have any information about the FFRF conference in the fall this year yet, other than you know what I can read on their website, that it's open and it's going to happen, but we'll see. So I guess that's all for now. And once again, if you have questions or would like to contact me, the email is phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com. Don't send too much private information, please. Just your phone number so I can call you. I am a talker. I like to do it that way. Send me an email if you have questions. Otherwise, maybe in 2021, I'll see you out there at a conference somewhere. Until then, ciao.
Jesus is one of the most influential and intriguing figures in all of world history. When I was a little kid, I was taught the story of Jesus. I started learning more about the history of early Christianity. The Sunday school version of the Jesus story was different to how it appears in the Bible.
A lot of Christians don't actually read the Bible historically.
The actual story is far more complicated and far more interesting. How did that version become the story most of my Christian friends believe? The original disciples were wiped out within 40 years of the death of Jesus Christ.
This is a profoundly traumatic time.
Things were not flourishing.
So this is a big issue.
How do you convince a bunch of Greeks and Romans to worship a dead Jew?
They've got to reinvent themselves.
What kind of Messiah tells his disciples to keep his work a big secret?
This is a problem. This is a marketing problem. Marketing.
Paul came up with fantastic marketing ideas. He reinvented the Messiah to be a superpowered celestial warrior king, turning water into wine,
walk on water, raise the dead. In terms of Christian theology, it's perfect.
Being a religion that celebrates somebody who has died on a Roman cross to a religion that celebrates that cross, that's the story of Christianity within 300 years.
It becomes a religion for the poor, who can all find in this a sense of a better tomorrow.
The churches explode in size.
It's an amazing feat in marketing the Messiah.
That's who Jesus is. It's a fascinating story. That's absolutely extraordinary.